Welcome back. We are all so glad you're joining us. ASAN appreciates your support, whether that's participating in our call-ins, sharing our resources, or donating. Every year, ASAN invites a group of autistic advocates from all over the US and Canada to learn about college advocacy and systems change in Washington, D.C. This is the part of the organization that I and my husband are most personally involved in terms of sponsorship, and it's the best thing I do all year. This year, we held ACI virtually. Despite circumstances, we were able to train a new class and adapt our programming to work with students from California to Prince Edward Island and Atlantic Canada. And in the following video, you'll hear from ACI alums, both from this year and previous years.
My name is Kayla Smith. I am the alumni of ACI 2020.
Hi everyone. I'm Hari Srinivasan, and I'm a student at UC Berkeley.
Hi everyone, my name is Esperanza Padilla.
My name is Huan Huang. I was an eager and excited participant during the 2018 ACI conference.
Hi, I'm Cassandra Crossman, and I was a participant for this year's session of ACI.
I'm Jessica Benham. I'm a queer, autistic woman who's been a union organizer and healthcare advocate. And now I'm the Democratic nominee for state representative in Pennsylvania's House District 36. I don't remember what year I went to ACI, but I do remember the joy of networking with other autistic people and the ways that those connections have now enabled me to continue to succeed as an advocate.
The week-long annual ACI Leadership Academy organized by the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network each summer is an incredible experience for any participant. Along with 18 other college-going students from across North America, I got to learn about autistic identity, self-worth and disability justice. As the only minimally speaking autistic in the group, I was exposed to a range of autistic views, which expanded my thinking on autism itself during just the course of a week.
It's an opportunity to not only learn about what I can specifically do on my college campus to make it a better place for people with disabilities and autistic people, but it's also a place where I can network with a whole bunch of people who have the same passions as me and people who are a lot like me too, since it's all autistic people.
I think of my favorite part of the program where I meet the fabulous disability rights advocate. I was so excited. I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I see them in person. I was so excited. And I'm happy that they fight for our community, fight for our rights, and I'm happy for that.
ACI means Autistic Community and Autistic Space. It is a space where we don't have to mask or hide our stimming. It is a space where we can discuss our goals for advocacy and our frustrations. It is what I really hope the future can look like, for others not to only just accept us, but to appreciate us as well.
Before ACI, I wasn't aware of how powerful our stories were in terms of influencing social change. But after ACI, I really realized a deeper understanding of how these stories could influence policy. And that's incredibly empowering, and it still sticks with me today.
Disability justice, though, boils down to a world of interdependence rather than independence. It left me thinking that rather than demanding a seat at the table, our task could well be to redefine the table itself.
It kind of hit me, to be include, to include everybody in a space like that. And for me, I want to include everybody and learn how to be accessible and accessible to everybody need and make sure they feel included, things like that.
You learn so much about the history of the disability rights movement, about the importance of intersectionality in our community, about project management, making inclusive and equitable goals, and about how to do legislative advocacy in person and virtually. What I have learned in ACI will not only make me a better advocate at my college campus, but outside my campus as well, and after I graduate.
We also learned a lot about disability culture and history, not just from the instructors, but we learned about it from each other because a lot of us came from very diverse backgrounds. I learned so much in ACI, more than I usually do in like a semester-long class.
One of the most impressive things about ACI, which I think makes it so powerful and so impactful for people, is we have the chance to talk with other autistic students about our goals, and it really builds a community.
It was fantastic to befriend other non-speaking autistic people and to realize our neurodiverse community is one of the most inspiring and powerful. I am so glad to be here with you all and tell you that being autistic is the most wonderful way to be. I am now 23 and am more courageous to fight for our rights and collective liberation.
Alumni of 2020 ACI. Woo!
Now it is my pleasure to announce Julia Bascom, ASAN's Executive Director. Julia Bascom is the Executive Director of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. As Executive Director, Julia has focused on building coalitions with other disability groups, building relationships with other civil rights organizations, and making ASAN's work and civil engagement in general more accessible to people with intellectual disabilities. Julia is the greatest. We could not have a better Executive Director at the current time. And she enhances all of our lives just tremendously. And I'm very excited for you to get to hear from her personally.
Hello! Thank you all so much for joining us this year. The ASAN Gala is very different this year, and I really appreciate everyone who has jumped into the unknown with us. The online format is new, but I'm really excited about the possibilities that it's opening up for us. Panels, Twitter chats, something with Animal Crossing I don't really understand, and the ability to include people from all across the country as we celebrate self-advocacy. It's cool stuff. Before we get started, I need to thank a few people. I want to thank the ASAN staff for making lemonade out of lemons over and over and creating this incredible virtual experience, our sponsors for supporting us through interesting times, our panelists for sharing their time and their brains with us, our awardees for all of the world-changing work they have done and will continue to do. And I want to thank you, the folks watching and tweeting and participating online with us. Your support and your advocacy makes what we do at ASAN possible and real. Our gala is always supposed to be a celebration of self-advocacy, and that wouldn't be possible without self-advocates all across the country fighting every day for a better future for our community. To state the obvious, 2020 has been a strange, scary, and chaotic year, and we are still facing uncertain times. There's a global pandemic, and many of us haven't been able to lead our regular lives since March. Our country is talking more about police violence and anti-Black racism, but action has been slow, and for many people of color, violent, structural racism has always been a part of their daily lives. We've had a presidential election unlike any other. We don't know when things will go back to normal. We do know that there are some things that can't and shouldn't go back to normal. But no one really knows what the future will hold. So this year, I just want to remind us why we are all here. As disability rights advocates, we can take this time to recenter on why we're doing what we're doing. The hard stories, the hopeful stories, and the stories that aren't written yet. And then, with those truths fresh in our hearts, we can take a deep breath, pick up the work again, and press on. So, I'm going to start with the hard stuff because that's the kind of year it has been. We are doing this work because right now, all across the country, disabled people are trapped in large group and institutional settings, struggling to be free. Or, they're on their own without supports, struggling to stay alive. Or, as a consequence of our system's failures, they're bouncing back and forth between those two hells. I personally know multiple people right now cycling in and out of hospitals because their state does not provide the right services to let them live in their homes. Or the state does, but it's on a different waiver. In every state, people are in crisis, and their crises are by and large preventable, often caused by the way the service system in their state has been designed. That's violence. Forcing into someone into crisis through bureaucratic design is violence. And too often, they and their families are told that the only way to get what they need is institutionalization. No one's freedom or well-being should be held hostage to a state's waiver structure, waiting list, or eligibility criteria. That is violence. We can do better. We are doing this work because, again, in every state, we have people who on paper are receiving wonderful, high-quality, community-based, person-centered services and supports, but who are living in what the light mail bags called an institution the size of one person. I know a young woman who is engaged to be married, but she is not permitted to be alone in the same room as her fiancé of 8 years. When she is upset, she likes to fix her hair, but the people in her life find this inconvenient and have all agreed not to help her. They don't want to reinforce the behavior. She expresses herself best through writing in her notebook, so now there are no pens or even pieces of scrap paper in the house. She can shower independently, but she takes a long time, so she's not allowed to shower by herself. This young woman is clearly not safe or free at home, but no report to Adult Protective Services or anyone else will be taken seriously because, you see, she has an intellectual disability. This is what her program says should be happening. Her guardian signed the form. Case closed. I want to be very, very clear. What is happening to that young woman is violence. And it is a form of violence that is happening to thousands of people with disabilities every day. We are doing this work because of them. And of course, there are the countless stories of disabled people who are victims of classic, fatal violence. As I write this, the news is breaking with the story of Walter Wallace, another Black disabled man murdered by the police. Walter lived in Philadelphia with his family, including his wife and 9 children. He was bipolar, and he was known by the police to be in crisis when they arrived. They had been called to the home 3 times the day before, and the family had called for an ambulance. His family and neighbors pleaded with the officers at the scene. Within 40 seconds of arriving, the officers shot him dead. Walter deserved better community-based mental health services, but most fundamentally, he deserved a world where law enforcement officers are not empowered to kill people of color at their discretion. We are doing this work because of Walter. We are doing this work because of Dylan Freeman, a 10-year-old boy described by his father as a beautiful, bright, inquisitive, and artistic child who loved to travel, visit art galleries, and swim. But to the rest of the world, Dylan was a multiply disabled child who was just too disabled to cope with. His mother suffocated him to death with a sponge in August. It remains to be seen if she will be held accountable for his murder, or if the case will be dismissed due to his disability. We know how this story goes. We don't know the story of who Dylan would have been. Someone else decided he wouldn't get to find out. We know he deserved a better story, and we know nothing about his story is unique. We are doing this work because every day, ASAN receives emails and Facebook messages about heartbreaking situations where services aren't there, rights aren't respected, and laws aren't being followed. We know that our society doesn't value disabled people, our rights, our futures, or our lives. Every day, disabled people are harmed by structural ableism, and every day, disabled people living at the intersections of multiple marginalizations experience compounded violence. And that is all true in a normal year, let alone in 2020. A lot of reporters have asked me this year what COVID-19 has taught us about disability rights. I've always given the same answer. For the disability community, and for marginalized communities in general, COVID hasn't taught us anything new. Rather, it's amplified and shone a crucial spotlight on the pre-existing brokenness of our systems. Institutions were already deadly. Our service system was already overstretched, underfunded, and unable to deliver on its promises of community integration, self-determination, and other fundamental human rights. Schools were already failing disabled students, healthcare systems were already discriminating against people with disabilities, and ableism, just like racism and misogyny and other forms of structural oppression, have always been woven into the fabric of this country. This isn't new information. If COVID-19 gives us the attention and the urgency to finally get to the roots of some of these problems and transform those systems into something closer to justice, then it's our duty as advocates to fight for that. Because these hard, awful stories are not isolated and they are not new. At the same time, awful stories are not the only stories that exist for our community, and they are not the only reason that we are in this work. We also have stories that show us what is possible and remind us of what we are striving for. For example, more and more people who can't use speech to communicate are getting access to AAC. AAC users, as well as their families, educators, and providers, are starting to get information from groups led by AAC users, like Communication First, or the Ask Me, I'm an AAC User Facebook group, where AAC users themselves can weigh in on what helps and what hurts. Over and over again, self-advocates are showing the world that, as Arundhati Roy said, there is no such thing as the voiceless, only the unheard or the deliberately silenced. And as more people get access to real communication, more and more non-speaking students are graduating college. Often, these students are the first non-speaking autistic student on their campus, but they're advocating hard to make sure they won't be the last. And they're joined, too, by college students with intellectual disabilities who are now a part of over 300 campuses. These students are changing the stories our society tells about what it means to be labeled as voiceless, as intellectually disabled, or as severely autistic. They are changing what it means to be a college student, a thinker, a learner, a communicator, and a member of our community. They are changing what it means to be a leader. I can't wait to see where their leadership takes us. This has been a year where the stories of our future have grown and changed and expanded to show a future where more and more of us belong. I want to recognize that our storytellers have kept us going through excruciating times. Autistic storytellers have taken back the mic, from Hannah Gadsby to Sarah Kerchak, telling stories about autism that are funny, raw, human, and most importantly, in the first person. ASAN put out our new book, Welcome to the Autistic Community, to give newly identified autistic people a lifeline into our community and the stories that we are writing for ourselves. And it's not just the autistic community. The disability community has been blessed by the work of storytellers and curators like Alice Wong, who this year released 2 incredible new anthologies. Disability Visibility, a collection of essential disability essays and personal stories by a huge range of disabled writers, and ADA 30 in Color, showcasing disabled writers of color talking about the implications and the limitations of the ADA on their lives and what their dreams of disability justice are. Notably, both anthologies also have plain language versions available for free online. Our storytellers are creating a world where more and more voices are heard, and the stories themselves are being made more accessible. And I've name-dropped these specific folks and works because I want you all to check them out. But let me be clear, there are so many new storytellers taking back the mic these days, it's getting hard for me to keep track. And that is a gift. As chaotic and deeply painful as this year has been, there have also been stories of advocates rising to the challenges and building a better world, here and now. Advocates nationally and in over a dozen states worked with the Office of Civil Rights at HHS to ensure that their states would not move forward with triage plans that explicitly discriminated against people with disabilities and disproportionately impacted disabled people of color. Instead, we rewrote those plans, and HHS issued official guidance from an administration that has been so hostile to disability rights that affirmed that our lives are worth living. Across the country, congregate day programs and sheltered workshops were forced to close their doors due to a global pandemic. Some of those providers still hope to reopen and continue segregating and underpaying disabled people, but others are thinking about converting their programs and offering truly community-based services when it's safe to reopen, and organizations and experts across the country are scrambling to help them make that change. School districts in Minnesota, California, and other states have removed police from their schools. Cities across the country are talking about ways besides police to invest in public safety. The disability community is having hard but long overdue conversations about policing, mass incarceration, and the racism in our community. And more organizations are going on the record that these things are disability issues too. Some of these changes are big. Some of them are small. all of them are insufficient, incremental, and a long time coming. But that's how social change happens. Inch by inch, hard-won victory by hard-won victory, until finally we hit critical mass and then change seems to happen all at once. It's not magic, it's hard work. And even then, as the last 4 years have shown us, we have to fight to hold on to what we've made. But we will make it. And as we think about the world we have to make, I need to remind us of some of the folks who were instrumental in dreaming it for us, but who won't be there with us to see it realized. One of the hardest parts of being in the disability community, for me, is that we lose such incredible people every year. This year we were dealt two particularly devastating losses, Mel Baggs and Stacey Park. Mel is responsible for so many of the neurodiversity movement's core values, our belief that everyone matters, that everyone has something to say, and that rights are for everyone, no matter what. Mel worked so hard to defend and share the humanity of non-speaking autistic people, people with intellectual disabilities, and people with the most intense support needs. Their work gave our movement our North Star. We owe them a debt we can never repay. And the same is true of Stacey, who is constantly dreaming and organizing new ways to practice disability justice, to center and love and honor disabled people of color, to find who is on the margins of our community and to bring them into the center. In 2018, Stacey famously said, "I want to leave a legacy of disabled people knowing we are powerful and beautiful because of who we are, not despite it." Stacey, it has been your legacy. Stacey and Mel were the best of us. We owe it to them to create the future they dreamed of. We owe it to them to do the work to get us all, every last one of us, there. So as we reflect on why we as disability rights advocates are in this fight and doing this work, even when it breaks our hearts, I want to take a moment to get real about what we still have to do. Our to-do list is still pretty long. We must end the institutional bias and ensure that everyone who needs support in their daily lives can exercise their right under the Americans with Disabilities Act and access that support in the community. That means ending waiting lists, paying direct support workers better, and enforcing regulations like the home and community-based settings rule and real quality standards so that these services really do support people to live the lives we want to live, rather than just creating mini institutions throughout the community like we have now. We have to ensure that every single person has access to real self-determination, no matter how complicated their disabilities are. That means access to robust AAC and effective communication for everyone. That means supported decision-making. That means accessible information, and it means rich relationships with real people in the community who can help you understand that information and make your own decisions. It means an inclusive education with high expectations and good supports for everyone. It means freedom from abusive therapies like ABA that teach us that our bodies aren't ours and our instincts are wrong. It means freedom from abuse and violence, period. We have to end the degrading and exploitative practice of paying disabled people, mostly people with intellectual disabilities, less than the minimum wage for our labor. We have to make sure that anyone who wants to work can work, a real job in the community with real wages and the supports we need in order to access that job. That might mean one-on-one support, or on-the-job accommodations, or accessible transportation, or access to health insurance and home and community-based services so we can get out of bed in the morning. And no matter what, whether someone can work full-time or not at all, we have to make sure that people needing services doesn't mean living in poverty, and that people who need income support like SSI have real financial security. And the ability to marry, too, while we're at it. And we need to think bigger than our traditional list of disability policy goals, and realize that racial justice is essential to ending ableism and non-negotiable for supporting disabled people of color. That means we need to work on defunding the police and creating better, more effective, and more equitable sources for public safety. That means ending mass incarceration, getting cops out of schools, and ending violent practices like restraint and seclusion and corporal punishment, which disproportionately impact disabled students of color. It means finishing the fight to reverse this administration's racist, ableist, and eugenic public charge rule, closing immigration detention camps and centers, and demanding justice for the victims of ICE brutality, like the survivors of forced sterilization we learned about this year. And it means white disabled people stepping up, stepping back, and doing the hard, messy, and complicated work of examining our own racism and complicity, and the racism of our friends. If we don't work to challenge racism within the disability community and push for more representative leadership and more inclusive norms, then all of our work is hollow at the center. Our community, our whole community, deserves better. We have to build stronger, reciprocal working relationships with the rest of the civil rights community, from racial justice coalitions to LGBT organizations to reproductive justice collectives. Whether we're talking about justice reform, voting rights, fair housing, economic justice, access to health care, or student rights, we have to be on the same page. And we still, in 2020 and beyond, have to champion and protect and, God forbid, actually enforce the ADA. Civil rights are not the end-all and be-all of justice, but they are a lodestone, and they don't enforce themselves. That's our job. It's a long to-do list, and even then it's incomplete. As we push for change and get closer to a fairer, more just, more inclusive world, we have to remember that no step forward has ever been allowed to exist without its own attendant backlash. In many ways, the more things change, the harder we have seen our opponents fight for them to stay the same. We still have folks arguing that some people are too disabled for civil rights. They don't say that outright, and the code words they use have changed. Severely disabled has become severe autism. Complaining that institution survivors are too high-functioning to speak for their family members has become hand-wringing about partial representation. Fighting to keep institutions open has become advocating for choice and a continuum of care. The organization that used to call itself Voice of the Retarded now calls itself Voice of Reason. In their calm, reasonable voice, they explain that rights-based advocacy simply isn't applicable to people with developmental disabilities. But we have to remember that this is nothing new. We have seen this before. They called the founders of People First high-functioning too. We can't let ourselves be fooled by the new words or the new hairstyles. This is the same regressive, harmful nonsense it has always been. These lies have always been told, and we can fight back with the simple truth. In May, ASAN released a joint statement with dozens of other organizations that support the rights of people with developmental disabilities, like the ARC of the United States, the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, newer groups like Communication First, and other major national organizations that have been in this fight for decades. Together, we affirmed that every single person with an intellectual disability, whether they can talk, whether they can sit through a policy meeting, whether they need support around the clock, whatever their needs might be, has the right to community integration, self-determination, respect, and inclusion. Period. End of sentence. We have known this to be true for a very long time. We do not have a world that fully reflects that reality yet, but we will get there, and that world is everyone's right. Every gala speech I've ever given has this part, where I remind our community that all means all, and that we are strongest when we are thinking about and including and fighting for our whole community. I am getting tired of saying this, but it hasn't stopped being true. And the truth remains that in order to really bring about the world we want, we have to embrace and center and lift up people with the most intense disabilities. We have to run to, not away from, the concept of disability altogether. When I say that autism is a disability, I am not saying it is something that it is a bad or shameful or dirty thing. I am not saying it is something that makes me less than. I am saying that I am proud of the things that the world wants me to hide away. I am saying that I need accommodations and support, and that is okay. That is my right. I am saying that disability itself, like autism, is not something that degrades or diminishes me. I am saying that I am proud, not ashamed, to share a community and a label and an identity with people who have intellectual disabilities, people who need more support than me, people who use wheelchairs, and people who don't talk at all. And I am saying, these are my people. And I am saying, we are beautiful, all of us. If disability rights advocacy is inaccessible, if disability rights advocacy revolves just around people with mobility disabilities, or people who need the least accommodations, or people who can say, well, at least my mind is fine, then it isn't disability rights advocacy. If autistic people say that autism isn't like those other icky disabilities, then that's not neurodiversity. And if our advocacy is only for white people, cis people, or people who haven't been forced to live in poverty, then it isn't justice. And if 2020 hasn't been enough to show you that, then I don't know what will be. I know it can feel impossible to take all of this on, to move through our to-do list, to make all truly mean all, to keep going after the last 4 years. So, to close us out, here's just a short highlights reel of the impossible things we have done in these impossible circumstances. We still have the Affordable Care Act. I know! 4 more years of the ACA after every pundit and politician worth their salt thought it would be dead in January of 2017. Medicaid is more popular than ever before. The ADA just celebrated its 30th anniversary, despite 30 years of folks trying to undo it. Against all odds, we have kept these gains and guardrails in place. We've refused to go backward, and we have taken on all who have tried. We got the FDA to finally put in place a ban on the skin shock devices used at the JRC. In 2020! The first real progress we have made on this in decades. That work is far from done. The ban still needs to be fully implemented, and the JRC is just a symbol of larger symbolic problems we need to tackle. We're going to talk more about that on Sunday, and I hope you'll join us. But this is a real, tangible step, and we achieved it against impossible odds. That's how I can know in my bones that we'll get the rest done too. All across the country, states and towns have done good. 8 states now have bans on some minimum wage, and so do Chicago and Seattle, with more on the way. 15 states have laws banning discrimination against people with disabilities seeking organ transplants. 16 states have laws formally recognizing supportive decision-making. Last year, I talked about my hometown institution. This year, it closed. 4 years ago, none of those things looked certain. None of them looked possible. We did them anyway. And that's how I know that we will rise to the challenge of the next year, and the year after that, and the decade and the century that follows. We know what we need to do. We know why it matters. We know what we are dreaming towards, and we know how much we owe the people who helped us dream it. We will honor those dreamers and honor the fight. We will take a deep breath and a nap if we need it, and then we will get back to it. We will keep going, and we will go harder, and we will get there together. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, for those important words and reminders, as well as a powerful call to action. Thank you all for joining us tonight. All of the work ASAN does would not be possible without the support of the autistic community. At 2 p.m. Eastern Time tomorrow, we will hold a program to recognize the survivors and advocates who worked tirelessly to ensure that the painful electric shock devices in use at the Judge Rottenberg Center were banned, and to discuss how far we still have left to go to ensure that all of us are free from seclusion, restraint, and institutions. Please be advised this event will contain discussion of torture, institutional abuse, and ableism. We encourage everyone to take care of themselves during and after. This event may also not be suitable for small children due to the subject matter.